Hello, everyone. Welcome to From Know to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. Perhaps the greatest paradox is that the hardest things to explain are often the simplest things at face value. If you've been listening to this show and, importantly, have been enjoying it, you've probably come to accept this. Reality just isn't readily comprehensible. And not just the big, complex phenomenon, but also the bedrock, the cornerstones, and the universal truths. To someone who opens their mind and truly thinks deeply and critically, the existential ocean has no floor. Today, we're attempting to glimpse the view from nowhere. So I like this a lot. You suggested this during the week that we should look at the concepts in our names. So this week we're going to look at nowhere, and then
our
next
titular
time
roots.
Yeah.
Do you remember how the name generated?
Yeah, it was it's a quote. Shoot, I'm forgetting the guy's name.
The philosopher is Thomas Nagel.
Yeah,
and he talks about the view from nowhere. But we were knocking things around, and then it just seemed like the right thing. And I've had people say to me when they find out we do a podcast, a couple of people this week is that they're going to start listening. Well, that's an interesting name. Does that mean nothing happens? No, something happens. We're talking to each other. We explore an idea. Does that mean we arrive at an answer? Only tentative at best and often not.
Yeah. Yeah.
But nowhere as a concept is just an amazingly...
It really is, because nowhere seems very intuitive, especially the way we use it in our colloquial language, until we ask, what or where is nowhere?
And then we step into your existential ocean and there is no bottom. So let's explore this. So when you think about nowhere, this is before we do the etymology on it. It can suggest an exclusivity to be something that's found nowhere else. It can be completely exclusive, meaning it just isn't there. It can indicate surprise, as when we say something comes out of nowhere. It can suggest a very frustrated inclusivity. Something is nowhere to be found. I looked everywhere. Well, both are not accurate.
Yeah.
But they seem to be, right? It can connote remoteness, nondescriptness, the pit of uninteresting, like being in the middle of nowhere. It also suggests fear because of an unknown origin. Something comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And on and on and on. Then I think about all kinds of pop cultural references, and I'll mention some of them. But
yeah, so that's a great overview of what I was just mentioning, like the colloquial uses of nowhere. We use it so often in our language, but a common trope of our show is that what comes so easily to language does not spring so easily to logic and rationality once experienced a little bit closer. So, this idea of nowhere, are there, I think you just mentioned it, but maybe we should ask more explicitly, are there types of nowhere?
There are types of nowhere. And again, I'm going to use pop culture because of what you just said. Our colloquial, it surrounds us. Nowhere is everywhere. I'm thinking of now this dates me, I know, but one of my favorite films is Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, with the original Star Trek people in it, right? And there's a scene where they're in a space station. Everybody's been killed. The people who are on the space station are not, their bodies aren't there. They think they may have beamed down into a little planetoid, but it's supposed to be that would be like beaming into a rock. And so why would anybody do that? And Kirk says, well, very well, let's go. And McCoy, called Bones, says, go. Where are we going? Kirk says, where they went. And he gets up on the transporter beam, and McCoy says, but what if they went nowhere? And Kirk says, this will be your big chance to get away from it all.
Yeah.
And so, there's the idea of emptiness, total nothingness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like, I think of Guardians of the Galaxy, and what's interesting is how the spelling changes the meaning of the word completely, almost to the opposite end of it, right?
Yes.
Nowhere connotes an absence of place, whereas nowhere, K-N-O-W, W-H-E-R-E, that's where, right?
Yes.
And that's sort of what we're getting at early in the show, right? Is how language, the concepts that language tries to encode, there's a strange thing that happens, right? Where if you use abstract academic jargon, then people don't understand concepts. And the simpler the languages you use, the more there seems to be a general understanding, until we start looking at, like I mentioned in the monologue, the bedrock or foundational concepts, the things that we think we know so well.
Yeah.
And then when we start to examine those, it's almost like, when you walk towards a mirror, where the closer you get to the mirror, the clearer it is, then you get to a certain point and everything flips upside down, right?
Yep.
It completely doesn't make sense anymore,
It
right?
disorients.
Nowhere is going to be one of those, I think.
Well, and you Guardians of the Galaxy, and that in turn cites Jack Kirby, who was one of the major artists and conceptualists in comic books from the 1940s until he was done, and he had a very up and down relationship with Marvel and Stan Lee and everything. But he developed so many of these ideas, and one of them was the Celestials, these gigantic beings who are somewhere way past us and yet very interested in us, and the empty skull of a destroyed Celestial is nowhere, which is what you were talking about, which is the Guardians of the Galaxy. But so this is a world inside a skull.
Yeah.
So the meta-ness and the psychologicalness of this is just jolly.
Yeah, exactly. So types of nowhere. What do we have? I think that the examples that you gave at the beginning when you were demonstrating the colloquial aspects sort of highlighted a little bit, but if we could be a little bit more explicit for the listeners,
so
maybe.
Nowhere suggests no place. Side note, we can get back to Thomas More and utopia. Utopia is a word that means no place. Where and place are a little bit different, but where suggests a location of some kind. So nowhere is no place, or a place we can't identify, or a place that's just not worth seeing. Three different meanings there. How can you be in the middle of nowhere? And wouldn't it be worse to be at the edge of the outer edge of nowhere?
But then you're almost somewhere, right?
Then you're almost somewhere else. That's right. And then the Beatles. He's a real nowhere man. So now we're moving it from a place more suggestively to the way one lives a life.
Well, and that's interesting because I read an article on IFL Science yesterday that I should have sent to you. I don't know why I didn't, but it was talking about how your language informs, your conceptual development and thinking, and therefore how you perceive time, right?
Yeah.
Well, a very important part scientifically of nowhere in terms of space is that space and time are considered one thing. So nowhere shares a lot of, in from certain contextual angles, depending on which type of nowhere you're talking about, can share some elements of timelessness in a way.
Know when.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting because the word know when was tried out rather equally etymologically back hundreds of years ago, but it never caught. Whereas nowhere did.
And that's one of the things that the article mentioned was, it was mentioning the difference between how English speakers and Spanish speakers, as one of its vignettes, how they perceive time. And they said that English speakers will refer to time in length. So, right now it's around Christmas time, so I'm going to have a break from work. So I'll say I have a long weekend in terms of length. Whereas they said people who speak, Spanish, put it in terms of size. So it's a big break instead of a long break, right? Mm-hmm. It seems very small, but it's a large conceptual difference. And so know where and know when, and this is a big stretch, but if we're talking about it from the point of view of physics, should sort of maybe be the same concept, but it appeals to people in a different way, probably because of their cultural and developmental background.
I think so. I think you're spot on about that. Our language borders us. Our language provides boundaries. We talked about borders last week. Our language creates boundaries which we can exceed by expanding our language or expanding the different languages that we try to acquire. But still, we construct ourselves with our language.
Yeah.
People can say, now that's ridiculous all they want to, but all you have to do is say, what if I took all of your words away?
And this is another discussion that me and my friends were having we call it family Christmas. None of us are related, but we're all friends. So we get together every year for
Friendmas.
For family Christmas. And we found out that one of my friends does not have an internal monologue. And that was shocking to the rest of our friends. And then we were discussing it. And then coincidentally, a few days later in my news feed, an article popped up about internal monologues in one of the psychology journals that I follow. And what the implications of that are. People who don't have internal monologues tend to have much less anxiety because there's almost an inability to ruminate. You think in pictures. And so this idea of going over prior conversations or future conversations doesn't occur to some of these people, or at least not in the same way that it does to people who have a voice inside their head, right?
Because most of us do have the voice inside of our head.
Yeah. Yeah. And so they said 30 to 50% of people do not
Most of us do not have a voice inside. Yeah. I'll retract what I just said. If it's that 50%.
30 to 50 is what they say. And for me personally, I noticed that it's something that goes in and out, right? I think that when I'm goal-oriented, I have an internal monologue. But when I am in my default mode network state, the sort of resting state, daydream sort of thing, it's all images. There's no words happening.
That's fascinating because I would say almost the opposite for me.
Yeah, isn't it? But this highlights how human development on a physiological level, much less a cultural level, informs our language, and then our language shapes our lives, as we're talking about, which may seem a little off topic, but it's really not, because right now, think about the word nowhere, right?
And what do you think when you hear it?
And we don't need to answer that yet because we're going to get into it in a little bit, but hopefully we've got the gears turning. So what have philosophers said about nowhere?
Well, we're going to go back to Diogenes, the guy who barked at people and left in a barrel. We've talked about him. But he described himself, the Greek word that becomes our word, cosmopolitan, citizen of the world. What does that have to do with nowhere? Well, it's not too hard to get there, because if you're a citizen of the world, that means you think in the broadest terms. You think about all of humanity. And that idea spins up into 1986 when Nagel writes his book. That idea spins into Stoicism. Once Stoicism was established, there was a philosopher named Hierocles. Hierocles conceptualized ethics in a way that was using the idea of nowhere. Concentric circles. Now, I think that you have encountered this in psychology with different terms, and you can tell me about this. But so that the innermost circle is yourself. The next circle is your immediates, spouse, family, friends, and then it goes outward and outward and outward to the whole planet. And when we start thinking of the whole planet, we think of it as nowhere that's not of interest, a place that is not to be bothered with by us. And Hierocles was saying what we have to do is try to pull those circles into tighter proximity to our first circle. Mm. And by doing that, by compressing the concentric rings, we are making people someone and making them from somewhere and trying to connect with that. And so I think that's an interesting philosophical not a side trip, but development in this whole idea.
Yeah. And that definitely does mirror not just psychology, but educational psychology, really, and how people sources of learning, right? Because what it comes down to is, your intellect and your emotions and everything about your brain comes down to being a learning machine, right? Mm-hmm. And so where do people get sources of learning from? And, Vygotsky and all of these other, educational psychologists and philosophers who were talking about, well, a lot of it is informed by the people around you. Yeah. And you have these spheres of relationships and things. So, yeah.
So instead of the circle, the sphere, but it develops into that. And you were talking about that on another podcast very recently when you, the idea of that, if you conceive of, well, I've worked hard all my life, now I'm going to retire and don't have to do anything. And then that puts you at higher risk of more immediate death, all other things being equal, if your health has been something, because you just stop.
Yeah.
But to be interested, to be learning, to say, wow, I don't know this and I don't know that, and I'm trying to, and to be engaged, then that's that active involvement with the spheres or the concentric circles. Then we get to the 1500s. We have Thomas More, who writes, utopia is not the only thing that Thomas More was writing. Thomas More lost his life to one of the Henrys Henry VIII, because he countered his former friend, the king, and was challenging him, and therefore needed to die. It's much more complicated than that, but that's the essence. But Thomas More wrote the first book called Utopia with that title, and utopia means no place. In other words, a picture of a non-existent society. In other words, kind of science fiction. But not place or no place, and nowhere, slightly different, but it takes us further toward that.
Yeah, I'm curious now, because you said that twice. What is the etymology of where? What do you know?
Yes. And well, I'm going to, and of course I picked it up and stuck it somewhere in my notes, but essentially, it hasn't changed all that much. So, where is associated with place, and no, the negative prefix. So where is Germanic, and it refers to the position. It really was the word position at first. And so, what position are you in?
And I think that does. It relays very different concepts, right? Mm-hmm. No place. I think that no place is more open to a physicalist interpretation, whereas nowhere has a very metaphysical context.
It does. It certainly does. Thus, nowhere man. You're nowhere man, or you can take, which people have done, the word and just place it slightly differently, and you have now here. And there's been lots of done with that with poetry and sociology and so on.
And I think that one integrates the time aspect of space-time there, right? Because now here implies that at some point there was, that there's something outside of here, which is sort of, I feel like anything outside of the present moment is sort of nowhere or not here, right?
Exactly. We talked about being in the moment. We did a talk about that, but the Heisenberg uncertainty principle applies. You can locate a particle in space, but not in time. You can locate a particle in time, but then not in space. But now here implies freezing.
Yeah.
Now here, this as if we could catch it. Try to catch a firefly, see what happens.
Yeah.
So even the idea of the present moment is an illusion. Here it is. Nope. What is? Are we talking about a quarter of a millisecond? Are we talking about the smallest increments? Are we talking about generally this is now? That means we've stopped time.
Right. And so I think that the scientific measurements of time are sort of analogous to the linguistic limitations of space. So with language, you have the same issues explaining nowhere as science and physics has explaining, the present moment, now here, right?
Yep.
So is nowhere purely a human intellectual construct? Does nowhere exist?
Well, I would go back to my literary argument that we've hit upon a number of times. It exists because we have created it as a concept. The trouble is that people have sometimes a difficult time separating the existence of a concept, and then making it as if history actually went that way. So people make up history all the time.
Yeah.
No, it didn't, no, the election was lost. No, dad was born this date, not that date. Nope, you're wrong. It was at 2 a.m. It wasn't 12 a.m. All of these factoids.
Yeah. And you and I have talked about this, I think last week off the air, because the course that I just wrapped up was, functional neuroscience and talking about various disorders and functions of memory and how, what goes along with learning, right? If the brain's primary function is learning, then its primary method of doing so is memory, right? If you have no memory, it's very hard to learn. And so, but what they know from imaging studies is that when you learn something, and then you have it in your memory, well, it's no good to you unless you retrieve it to use it later. But when you retrieve it to use it, it is as if you were experiencing that memory as a real thing again for the first time, making that memory subject to change and manipulation, right? And so in the healthy brain, our memories are subject to being changed. And so even if it were possible, right, for us to accurately, objectively chronicle something that happened, which it's not, we would store that memory. And then when we would recall that memory later, what we are experiencing in that moment is going to shade and color that memory. And then every time after that, when we recall that memory, the memory continues to be shaded and colored. And so you can imagine if we're thinking about this like a painting, right? Let's say you paint a painting.
Sure.
And then imagine every time you wanted to look at that painting again, you had to add something to it, right? You had to add a shade of color over it or add some lines here or do this sort of thing. Well, over the course of a lifetime, that painting is no longer the same thing that it was when it happened.
It might even be a square or a rectangle that is nothing but black or brown or mud.
Yeah, and that's the other part of what we talked about and that's in the healthy brain, right? In the disordered brain, in Korsakoff syndrome, which is a form of dementia caused by alcoholism, or Alzheimer's or these sorts of things, you have situations where, your memory is stored in different parts of the brain. And then as neuronal death occurs in certain parts, the brain is only able to retrieve part of a memory. And so what it does is your brain is just a brilliant adaptive machine, right? It doesn't just give up or say that, error 404, memory not accessible, right? No, it gives you part of it that you have, but then it fills in all the blanks from the brain tissue, the memory circuits that are no longer there. And so you start combining diverse memories, or you have what they call spontaneous confabulation, where you just start making things up. They had a classic example of a guy who, his disease was so advanced that he had nothing at all of his former life, but he sort of wandered off from his care facility and got into a cab, and the cab driver, he kept telling the cab driver to go to different places, and then it wasn't the place that he wanted to go, so he told him to go to a different place.
Yeah.
Long story short, after several hours of this cab driver driving around, that the care facility got a hold of him and said, "Oh, thank goodness you found him, bring him back." And the cab driver said, he is the most interesting person I have ever met. He's like, I don't know how one person has done so many things in their lifetime, right? Because he didn't know this guy, right? So when he was telling him stories of adventure or of doing all of these different things, he didn't know that they weren't true because the confabulations were so honest, right? Yeah. He wasn't making up stories rationally. It was something that was arising from deeper structures of the brain. Yes, he believed them. And so that highlights that belief does not constitute truth or rationality in an outside way.
Right. It can be experiential on the inside of a kind, but not on the outside. This is what Thomas Nagel was talking about when in his book, The View from Nowhere, essentially going off of what you were talking about a moment ago, the idea of objectivity. Even though we know we can't achieve an ultimate objectivity, and take some kind of transcendental position in which you are taking the position of the other, walking in somebody else's shoes, in a simplistic way to say it. And so you travel. And even if you don't take in everything, because you can't, if you take in some of what's happening in your travel, it's disorienting you toward the idea that your way of doing things is the only way, and your way of doing things is the right way. And so when you return from travel, whether it's domestic or international or into space or whatever it happens to be, you have the possibility of rethinking your being, and so the objective is not perfect, but it resets the subjective, which is what we generally see things through. So if we make the attempt to see things objectively, and we acknowledge at the same time we can't be perfectly objective, we are going to grow and change our own viewpoints. And so he calls the objective the view from nowhere, because essentially you are not you're trying to be out of your own self and not being connected to a particular viewpoint.
Yeah, and this reminds me of the book that you and I both read by Stephen Hawking and Thomas Herzog, right?
Yeah.
Where Hawking spent his whole life thinking about the origins of the universe, and the conclusion he came to towards the end of his life, right, was that the main issue with all of the theories that he had looked at was that humans were taking a God's eye view, which is the view from nowhere, right? That's kind of the same thing that Nagel's saying. So, I think that the idea of, is nowhere a purely intellectual human construct? Well, I think that it's contingent, right? Because as we've talked about, there's several types of nowhere. So perhaps some of them aren't, could exist in a metaphorical sense. But if we're thinking about the metaphysical idea of nowhere, a place that does not exist,
a place that does not exist within our immediate context, or a place that does not exist in the sense that we can't see it. We can only theorize about it.
Yeah. So existence is a funny word as well, right? Because so can nowhere exist? Well, if we're getting into metaphysics and physics, right? Now I think we're talking about outside of the universe. And I think that we default to thinking that outside of the universe is nowhere. We don't have any reason to believe that. We don't have any reason to believe anything about anything outside of the universe. But I think that we tend to conceptualize the outside of the universe as being nowhere.
And that is what Nagel is talking about. Nowhere is no particular place. And the fact that a human being can conceptualize what's beyond the universe, or when it's beyond the universe, that puts us outside of the subjective, ordinary experience. We live in our skin, but sometimes we can toss ourselves way outside of it, and frustrate ourselves and lure ourselves and entertain ourselves and be driven by a curiosity that is insatiable, that in a standard, just subjective view might not be.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of the problem that a lot of lay people have with like the Big Bang Theory, right? Is because when you start at the beginning, you're like, okay, well, all of space and time is an infinite point. And then there was a sudden expansion. The first question everybody asks, right, is, well, what was it expanding into? Well, is expanding into nowhere, right? But nowhere is not another space. It's not another time. It's nowhere.
It's
right?
nowhere.
And that's a concept that sort of breaks the human brain. So on one hand, we are able to conceptualize nowhere. But on another hand, when we attempt to apply that concept to our physical reality, we get the error 404 message. It cannot compute. The page you're trying to locate cannot be found.
And we start pounding on the screen.
Right.
I'm thinking about this, the science. I'm thinking about this week. All these things. It's so much fun. But think of the God particle, the so-called God particle that frustrated and conceptually Stephen Hawking, and that is spun up in Lucerne in the Large Hadron Collider. But then one comes, and the scientists are able to capture it. They refer to it with another word along with God because they're frustrated, but because they don't know where it came from. There was no discernible origin point. It came from nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that some of that frustration, right? So you have the Higgs boson, which, the Higgs gives mass to everything, right? And that mass is obviously an integral part of reality, right? You look around, you go, well, everything has it, right? It's sort of the same frustration that psychologists and philosophers have with consciousness, right? Because with human beings, explanations require points of origin.
Yes.
And so the Higgs boson, the Higgs field, there has to be somewhere it comes from. Consciousness has to arrive from somewhere in the brain. But if you look at it and you go, well, no, consciousness is just this widely distributed field that's throughout the brain, then consciousness is at the same time coming from nowhere and everywhere. And that raises very difficult philosophical questions, right? Like, if I lesion a tiny part of my brain, am I still me? Am I still fully conscious, right? As we talked about.
We're back to the ship of Theseus.
Yeah, again, and the people with Korsakov's and Alzheimer's and these sorts of things, right? At what point are you always the same person or are you not the same person?
Spontaneous confabulation, is that the
term? Yeah.
Okay. So what I was thinking when you were describing that, and indeed when we were talking off air last week, is it's a marvelous phrase or term, but that man in the taxi, he wasn't artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
He was intelligence, because artificial intelligence, as we know now what's happening, will leap to confabulating all kinds of things, will create articles that do not exist.
And that's the difficult part, right? Is because it's easy to look at somebody with Korsakov's or Alzheimer's and say they're spontaneously confabulating. But then when we go back to my example of the healthy brain, where every time you retrieve a memory, you're coloring it in some way, that's also confabulation.
Slow confabulation.
Yes,
right?
it's also confabulation.
Accrual.
And as you've just pointed out, artificial intelligence, right? It's essentially a confabulating machine, a very accurate one, but all it's doing, right, is predicting what the next word should be.
Right. It should be, it's concatenating. Computers concatenate. And artificial intelligence, as it is developing, seems to be able to do mighty fine concatenation. Scans everything really fast. I want to know everything about Thomas Nagel. Write an essay about Thomas Nagel. Well, when you get to that point, then it puts together paragraphs. But then if it needs something else, even money, I guess now that it may say, oh, well, and as this person said in this article, in this journal, none of which exist.
And so, yeah, this seems like a bit of a tangent, but now we're going to draw the parallels back again to physics and metaphysics, right? So if consciousness is something that requires, a giant distributed network in the brain, and therefore is both everything and nothing, right? And we see the effects of that with confabulation on an extreme end, but also with just the mere act of recalling a memory. On the physics side of it, right? We go, okay, well, there's the Big Bang, just this infinite point of density at the beginning of time. And now we have a whole universe. And so nowhere, at one point appeared to be everything but this small point. And now nowhere is
flipped.
Nothing. Yeah. Nowhere is nothing, right?
Yeah.
Because everything is now here. There is no nowhere,
Wonderful.
but there has always been nowhere, right? So how do we parse apart these concepts? Can nowhere actually exist in a physical or metaphysical sort of way, do you think?
So, when you say actually exist, is it a place? Is that what you're saying? Is nowhere a place?
I guess that's sort of contradicted by the etymology of the word, isn't it?
Well, not necessarily, because if nowhere can exist personally, as in, I don't know where we are. And then we go back to the Jack Kirby thing. I know where we are. So nowhere can imply a disorientation because of lack of information. It can imply not think about metaphorically, nowhere exists because it is a concept. It exists also in a variety of stack of colloquial ways, as we've said before. I'm trying to pull that together too. But if we think about this, and we think, in my life, I'm going nowhere, referencing the Beatles song and umpteen other things. What are we saying about what our culture expects of us? We are supposed to go somewhere. It says go where? Why do we think that motion is always the necessity and the thing to be valued and therefore connoted positively? And lack of movement toward a place is therefore negative or indicative of a failure. I'm going nowhere. We're all going nowhere because none of us knows where we're going, because despite any theological position of faith, ultimately no one knows.
Yeah. And there's another interesting parallel between psychology and physics here, right? We've talked in the past about the block universe, right? which is where essentially the past and the future have already happened.
Already happened.
Time is just our brain's way of interpreting it. So if you look at it that way, there is no motion, right? All of our lives are there in crystal format. So motion is an illusion, right? Well, there are certain brain deficits that will manifest this, right? You don't know this, but there's two sections in your brain that detect movement. One detects organic movement and one detects inorganic movement, right? And so various deficiencies in either one cause different issues. If you have a deficiency in the organic part, right, you can end up with face blindness, which is where, so my brain identifies your face using a bunch of information. But a separate part of my brain encodes how to determine movement. So if I have damage to that part, right, if I look at your face head on, I know it's you. But if you turn your face just a little bit to this way, all of a sudden I don't know who you are anymore, right? And so the motion is what gives meaning to the information that's coming in one frame of reference, and then another frame of reference, the motion is irrelevant. And so when you think about that, you try to think about it objectively, right? You'd go, well, the motion for recognizing a face is irrelevant. A face is a face, right? Your face doesn't change. It's just my ability to perceive the motion is what is the problem. So right now, the audience is thinking the mirror hasn't just flipped upside down. The mirror is spinning in circles, right? Okay, so maybe it'll help us if we ask the question, what purpose does the concept of nowhere serve? We've identified that if nothing else, nowhere at least exists because we can conceptualize it.
Yes.
Why do we conceptualize it? What's the point?
All right. You're implying a teleological, a word we've used a number of times, a built-in purpose. All right, so I'll run with you on this. Let's say it has a purpose. To me, referencing what we were just talking about a moment ago, the purpose is to cause us to do a full engine stop, if we use a sailing metaphor, to consider where we are if we are lost. What do you do if you are lost? Let's suppose for a moment that we don't have internet connectivity, and we are driving somewhere, and let's say it's getting to the edge of night. What do we do? Well, there are lots of different ways to address that. Let's say you're sailing a ship and you have no equipment that's working. Do you come full stop? Do you hoping that nobody else is on the same track as you are? Do you use the stars if you've learned how to do that? And so nowhere is a useful slow down to rethink what you thought you knew about the world and where you are in it.
I think that's a really good explanation, while also really opening itself up to the profound difficulties with the conceptualization, right? Because I think you're absolutely right. When we think about how we use nowhere to imply, and I think this is getting at the heart of it, right? That there's a mystery or a lack of knowledge about location, right? And our primary use for it, the purpose that the conception serves, is to help orientate. So like you said, usually it requires a slowing down or a stopping in order to gain a landmark of some kind to orientate to go somewhere. So there's a mystery or a lack of knowledge. There's an orientation and there's a destination that is involved with why this concept even exists, why it serves a purpose. But at the same time, if we examine it further, right, we'll stick with the ocean metaphor, right? An existential ocean, one might say, right?
With no bottom.
Yeah. So we're on this ship, and this ship loses its navigation, and we go to use our sextant or whatever, and then that's broken, and then we go to look at the stars, but it's completely cloudy and we can't see any of them. And we try to find the wind and we can't find any wind. If you remove every landmark, right, there's nothing but you and the water. There's no way of telling where you are. Then can that place, right, exist? Is the only purpose of nowhere to help us define a somewhere, to define a somewhere and a motion towards that somewhere? Or can nowhere exist on its own?
I think nowhere can exist on its own, but I think that, probably glibly, but I think of it because I want to. Somebody else thinks that's going to be funny, right? But I think it's useful for that contextual reset. But it's also useful to say, well, there may be a somewhere that the particle comes from. There may be a somewhere or someone that the thing has disappeared into that I'm looking for, the keys to the car or whatever. But it's also, it's a spiritual, can be a spiritual state. It can be an intellectual state in which if you feel you're nowhere, you've lost all of your bearings. And to lose all of your bearings is to say, well, then I have to make a choice. I have to find a way, or I just stay still until the clouds go by and the stars come out. I just float for a little bit. And that's almost goes into the Zen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are getting there. We're getting into the religious or the philosophical or because when we talk about true nowhere, absolute nowhere, right? We're talking about an uncaused cause, kind of, right? Because when we think about, okay, the Big Bang, that singularity being the universe, well, that singularity is still a somewhere, right? But anything outside of that or anything before that is a nowhere. And that's what gives people fits, right? Is this idea that in the chain of causality, you can go back to a point where there's an unmoved movement.
And if there's an unmoved movement, that implies that it was always there, but always means nothing ever created it. It was just there. That's counter to everything that we know.
Right. And I think that that's the core issue of this, right? Is that our main usages of nowhere are really on a spectrum of nowhere, right? Because what they imply with our ocean metaphor, right, is that the clouds will clear and the stars will come out, or you'll fix your sextant, right? Or the wind will kick up or something. But true nowhere, if we go to 0 or 100, I guess, on the nowhere scale, what that implies is that there are no stars. There is no sextant. There is nothing, right? And I think that absolute nowhere
is a frightening concept.
And it strips that utility of shades of nowhere away from the core concept. And I think that that's where the opening for Zen or religious concepts come in to try to fill that gap that says, essentially, if you're never going to have, if you get to a point where there's no navigation at all, there is no somewhere, there is no movement towards somewhere, there's no orienting towards somewhere, all there is nowhere, then that emptiness creates an anxiety in the human mind that has to be filled.
Well, this is, I think, really partly what Sartre and the existentialists were talking about in a fresh way. But I also have to, because I know we're getting toward time, but Nagel was using the word nowhere, at least sometimes, in part, as a substitute term to freshen up the idea of universality. So everywhere, in the sense that when you step out into the objective and you are in no particular place, that means that there are some things that are true no matter where you are. Or then we get into the ethics. Some things we believe that must be true for all human beings, no matter. And if a culture is not letting all the human beings have all those universal things, then we start saying, well, the culture's got to change. And that implies all sorts of socio-political complexities we won't go into today. But nowhere can mean a space above the petty association with some specific place that somehow gives viability to thoughts that 10 miles over here don't hold any purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that we see it's kind of like Roger Penrose's cyclical universe, right? Where if you are in true nowhere, then you are everywhere, right? Because there's a uniformity, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what Zen is talking about. That's sort of, and that crosses philosophical concepts into the other parts, right? Where you go, yes, if you get to a point where you have no orientating landmarks, then place ceases to have any kind of real purpose, you know? And so nowhere becomes everywhere counterintuitively, but
it becomes cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
Universal sense.
So yeah, this has been a great episode, and it really gets me excited for next time when we'll talk about no thing. So until next time, keep pondering.